Alright, so now we're on the second lesson of the socialist political philosophers from the A-level political ideas unit, and today we are going to be going over the evil Santa Claus whom takes away your toys and forces you to share them with the collective, Karl Marx himself. And he lived between 1818 and 1883. And obviously, like you probably know, he was a German. Marx and his opinions on the theory of history. As you likely already know, the philosophy of Marxist socialism comes from two key texts, which are the Communist Manifesto, written by both Marx and Friedrich Engels, and Das Kapital. Marx worked closely with his friend Friedrich Engels, and together they birthed the philosophy that we know today as Marxism. Marx believed that humans were both social and economic beings, and they argued that human nature had been corrupted by capitalist ideals that permeated society, thus making people selfish and atomistic. Atomistic basically means that they are an individual, they don't really have many social connections. So it lacks the fraternity aspect of Marxism, which essentially just means brotherhood. This is evidently an elaboration on the theory of the state of nature proposed by Jean-Jacques Rousseau from his book A Discourse upon the foundation of the inequality that exists amongst mankind. Once again, that book is popping up, elaborating on some socialist ideas. So, like you can probably tell, it's very important to socialism. In this book, Rousseau laments about the action of the first man who created the idea of private property, and he proposes, with his theory of history, that in the state of nature, men lived with one another in peace and harmony without private property. For socialists, this theory results in the belief that man is born good and is corrupted by society. This pure man in the state of nature is called the noble savage. The idea of the noble savage was famously adapted in Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, although it must be noted that Brave New World was not a socialist novel. From this, you can likely see why socialists do not hold criminals culpable for their actions, as they believe their behaviour is symptomatic of a sick and degenerate capitalist society. Marx and Capitalism. Marx believed that capitalism instilled a false consciousness into mankind, which eliminated man's natural instincts. I put natural in quotes there because most Enlightenment philosophies have an idea about what man is naturally like, and as you can probably tell, a lot of them disagree. And most of their suppositions are baseless, so they have no evidence for their belief that, oh, man is like this in the state of nature. They just use it to justify their philosophy, and it's incoherent and based on mysticism that you likely know comes from Plato and his book The Republic, in which he stipulates the idea of a world of forms. Obviously, it would be adapted by Immanuel Kant into the noumenal world, but we're getting ahead of ourselves. So he believed that these natural instincts, which were fraternal and cooperative, so in the state of nature, Marx believed that men had a strong sense of brotherhood and they were heavily cooperative. As a result, Marx believed that capitalism must be overthrown to eliminate the social conditioning of the masses. The important thing to take away from this is the fact that Marx believed that men were inherently cooperative in nature, thus proposing an optimistic view of human nature. Marx argued that the proletariat, those whom did not own the means of production were being exploited by the bourgeoisie, those whom owned the means of production, due to the fact that the profit made from the sale of goods was not equitably distributed among the workers. Marx therefore believed that the profit motive resulted in the exploitation of the worker. He did not account for the difference in stakes in the enterprise, because obviously if we go back to the pencil factory analogy, the bourgeois business owner whom has purchased the pencil making machine, he's had spent a lot of money into that, and he's obviously had to work to get that money to pay for the machine. And if the business goes under, well, the man who works at the machine, so the proletarian, he's not really invested the same amount. If the business goes under and now that machine is worthless to the bourgeois business owner, he's just lost everything he invested in the enterprise. So let's say the machine costs 10 grand, he's 10 grand under, whereas the proletarian worker just has to find another pencil making factory because he's selling his labour, whereas the bourgeois business owner is selling the product itself, and he's responsible for the worker to be able to actually make the product. So, where are we at now? Due to the fact that the profits made from the sale of goods was not equitably distributed among the workers. So, we've done that. Marx believed that capitalism encouraged the competitive drive within man, so essentially making men more cooperative, which he believed was undesirable. Competitive. And he believed that the surplus value generated by the sale of goods should not be taken by the bourgeoisie as profit. So he strongly opposed the profit motive. In essence, Marx and the communist state. Marx believed that capitalism sow the seeds of its own destruction by igniting resentment between workers and employers, and thus inspiring a class consciousness. Marx argued that revolution was not just inevitable, but it was essential. They asserted that in the new state, the proletariat should assert dominance over the former ruling class, the bourgeoisie, and establish a dictatorship of the proletariat. So essentially the working class dominate society. He believed that the communist state would be brought about by a vanguard of intellectuals who would form a temporary government to rule the dictatorship of the proletariat and set up the workings of the state. Marx believed that this temporary government would eventually wither away, leaving a cooperative state with no government. So they're essentially very similar to the ideas of anarcho-communism. And it's one of the main reasons why much of the anarchist movements of the early 20th century, so if we're thinking off the top of our heads, the anarchists who fought in the Spanish Civil War, were so closely affiliated with the communists and the syndicalists. So if we think about George Orwell's opinions that he talks about in his book Homage to Catalonia, when he served in the Spanish Civil War, he talks about how there was little distinction between the left, whom were fighting Franco's fascists, between the people fighting for the anarchists, the POUM, which was the syndicalist party, and the communists. Obviously, the anarchists and POUM would eventually be crushed by the communists whom were getting Soviet aid. So Marx believed that this new state would be governed by the principle of from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. And if you are interested in seeing the other side of that coin, we talk about the exact same principle in our video on Ayn Rand and her philosophy of objectivism. And he goes very deeply into explaining why this principle is a bad idea in her book Atlas Shrugged, with the story of the 20th century motor company. So, let's take a look at Marxian value theory. Marx asserts that value is not subjective, as is supposed by capitalism. In the capitalist economy, value is determined via the free market and the aggregate decisions of producers and consumers. In layman's terms, this is described as supply and demand dictating value. Marx believed that there was such a thing as objective value to a product, and he believed that it could be determined by how much labour has been invested into the production of a particular good. Hence why it's sometimes called the labour-based theory of value as opposed to subjective theory of value. Essentially, Marx believed that the more labour has been put into the construction of an item, the more that item is worth. This belief was deconstructed by Robert Heinleins in Starship Troopers, where he critiques Marxian value theory with the following quote, which establishes how labour does not equate to value. This very personal relationship, value, has two factors for a human being. First, what he can do with a thing, its use to him, and second, what he must do to get it, its cost to him. There is an old song which asserts the best things in life are free. Not true, utterly false. This was the tragic fallacy which brought on the decadence and collapse of the democracies of the 20th century. Those noble experiments failed because the people had been led to believe that they could simply vote for whatever they wanted and get it, without toil, without sweat, without tears. So that's a very good quote from Starship Troopers. We went over Robert Heinlein in another lesson when we were talking about libertarianism and some of the new right philosophies of the mid to late 20th century, so the Cold War era. So that's it for Karl Marx. He's probably the most important one to revise if you're going to be talking about communism and socialism in an exam. However, he's kind of the one that everyone knows about, so it's less impressive if you reference him. So I'd recommend learning it, but focus on some of the other socialist philosophers more to prepare for the exam.